Hey everyone, Howie Fisher from Fisher's Flies. Thanks for checking in. Today I'm going to be tying up a classic dry fly pattern, the Stimmy. For the hook, to get started, I'm using a Firehole 718. You could also use an Ahrex 518, which is another similar, very phenomenal hook. For thread, I like to use a 140 Denier UTC thread. I'm using fluorescent orange here. I really like a thicker thread on this fly, especially in the larger sizes. Just helps with securing your hair without making it flare too much or cutting through it. To start off, I'm going to get started with my thread on the hook, and I like to bring my thread all the way back to the bend of the hook to start. One, this helps me have a visual tie-in point of where I want my materials to end and helps me be consistent in where I'm tying all of my materials into. For the tail on this pattern and the wing on this pattern, I'm using premium Yearling elk. Once I get my clump stacked and ready, I'm going to measure the tail to be about 1/3 of the length. I personally like to start this far up into the hook and take a couple wraps and cinch it down very tight, as you can see. This will help it from rotating. Then I like to bring my thread back to that tie-in point I created. And as you work your way back towards the very end, you can slightly start getting your wraps looser and looser. Then I'm just going to return my hair to the head of this clump, wrap through it, cut at a shallow angle, and secure those butts. If these butts aren't super clean or super nice, it truly doesn't matter. They're going to end up getting covered up by more thread and dubbing as well. So don't fret if you have a messy head like you see here. For the ribbing here, I'm using Brassie Ultra Wire in gold. One tip that I like to do is you can see here that I'm not actually tying my thread or my material all the way back to that tie-in point that I originally made. I like to leave that a little bit short, and I'll show you why in a second. For the dubbing here, I'm using Superfine dubbing from Wapsi. There's a lot of other alternatives you can use. I'm using amber on this one. I'm going to go ahead and create a long, slender dubbing noodle. Probably will have to make 2 of them to get to the front of the body. Doesn't take a whole lot of dubbing to cover that noodle. And this is why I like to leave that tie-in point a little bit shallow actually on the tail, because I'm going to use my dubbing noodle to wrap backwards over the tail to try and collect it and make sure that it doesn't splay out too much. You can see it just does a really nice job of collecting those tail fibers and making sure that they stay together. Again, I'm going to continue to add the amount of dubbing that I need on this noodle to get all the way to where I want the head to be. For the body of this, a good measuring point is about 2/3 of the hook shank. I'm just creating a little bit of a taper here that will make tying the rest of the body and the head a little bit easier. So again, just creating another little dubbing loop to try and get to that point where I want it. And you can see here, I've got about 1/3 of the hook shank left. And that body and that dubbing is covering about 2/3. Once I've done that, I'm going to go ahead and tie in my hackle feather. I've got a tip video on how to tie in hackle feathers a little bit easier if you've never watched that, but I'm going to go ahead and prep my feather by taking off some of the fibers from below or the very end, and I'm going to go ahead and tie that in with the colored side facing myself. And then I'm going to go ahead and take one full wrap at the head and then open spiral wraps back to the end of the tail or the end of the body. Once I get my hackle feather where I want it, I'm going to go ahead and take my wire and secure that hackle feather with a wrap. Once I've got about a wrap or a wrap and a half, I can let go of that hackle fiber completely, as you see here, and then just wrap my wire all the way forward. When you tie it in this way, it will actually naturally counter wrap the feather and make it a little bit more durable. I'll go ahead and snip the hackle feather off. This step's not completely necessary, but you can use a pair of scissors to cut just the tips of your hackle fibers off the top of the fly. This will help your wing lay down just a little bit flatter, a little bit neater. Before actually tying my wing in, there's one more tip that you can do to really help make this process a little bit easier, and that is just adding a little bit more dubbing to the head. So as you can see right now, the head of this fly, or where the head will be, isn't very wide. There's not a lot of material for those elk fibers to grab onto, so you can do yourself a little bit of a favor and just add a little bit of dubbing like you see me doing here, and that will give your elk fibers just a little bit more to hang on to. It will make this process less of a headache and keep your fibers from spinning around the hook shank. As far as the length of my wing goes, I like my length to be a little bit longer than my body. I don't want it to go all the way to the end of the tail, but I want it to slightly overlap. And that's just a personal preference. Some people like it a little bit longer, some people like it a little bit shorter. I'm going to go ahead and wrap through my butts as you saw me do there, and then I'm going to go ahead and snip them off. I made the mistake here, as you can see, of letting go of my butts rather than cutting them off right away. So if you cut your butts off before letting them go, it will make trimming this head much less of a headache rather than what you saw me do here. I'm going to go ahead and just start to build up a little bit of a taper for this head. You want a nice little bit of a taper. It will help finishing the fly easier. I'm going to do the same process with my hackle fiber here, and I'm going to tie it in again on the near side of the hook to myself. Again, starting to make that taper just a little bit better. If you've got a little bit of a splay in your wing here, it's okay. We're going to do the same thing. So I'm going to add my dubbing noodle, or my dubbing, to make a little bit of a dubbing noodle. And I'm going to take my dubbing noodle, and I'm actually going to start by wrapping backwards towards the back of the fly over the wing to try and collect it and make it just a little bit neater, a little bit nicer. And again, just add as much as you need to get to the actual eye of the fly. Once you think you have enough hackle or enough dubbing, go ahead and stop. You're probably good to stop a turn shy of where you think is enough, because that will help you to finish the fly. You really don't want to crowd the eye on this, or it'll make it a pain to finish it. So I'm going to take my hackle and I'm going to make open spirals again, and I'm going to secure it. And again, you can see I stopped short of the eye just a little bit here, and what that does is it makes it super helpful and super clean in finishing this. It makes a super clean head, and it makes it easier to just whip finish this fly. Once I've cut my hackle feathers off, I personally, again, like to add a little bit of Solarez bone dry. I personally prefer this over head cement because I feel like I have a little bit more of control over where it goes, and I can get it in there a little bit nicer. So there you have it. This is the classic dry fly stimulator.